The silver chopsticks moved with surgical precision as Jean Quan separated the delicate flesh of the black cod from its bones. Each movement was deliberate, controlled, like everything else in his carefully orchestrated world. The private dining room of Hanoi, Chicago's most exclusive Korean restaurant, hummed with the low conversation of legitimate business. Oil futures, real estate acquisitions, the kind of transactions that looked pristine on paper while serving far more complex purposes beneath. Jin's charcoal Armani suit was immaculate despite the humid August evening. At 34, he carried himself with the kind of absolute stillness that suggested violence held in perfect check. His dark eyes missed nothing as they tracked the movements of his dinner companions, cataloging micro-expressions and nervous gestures with the precision of a predator evaluating prey. The dragon tattoo that curved along his left shoulder blade remained hidden beneath expensive Italian wool, but its presence emanated through his posture like a coiled threat. "Where are you watching from tonight?" The story of power and protection we're about to witness could unfold anywhere, but there's something about Chicago that makes every encounter feel more dangerous, more electric. Drop a comment and let us know your city, because this collision between two worlds is about to change everything. The restaurant's main dining room buzzed beyond the frosted glass partition. Jean preferred this separation. Privacy meant control. Control meant survival. His fingers absently adjusted the platinum signet ring that bore his family's clan symbol, a gesture so habitual he barely registered the weight of legacy it carried. Aria Thompson balanced 6 plates along her left arm with the fluid grace of someone who had spent 3 years perfecting the art of invisible efficiency. The dinner rush at Hanoi demanded precision. Every table held customers who expected perfection and had the money to ensure they received it. At 28, Aria had learned to read people quickly. The tech executives who needed their egos stroked. The trophy wives who measured their worth in the cost of their entrees. The quiet men in expensive suits who spoke in careful undertones about things that never appeared on any legitimate balance sheet. Her black uniform was crisp despite the kitchen's heat. Natural hair pulled into a sleek bun that emphasized the elegant line of her neck. Aria moved through the dining room like water, finding its path, anticipating needs before they were voiced, solving problems before they became complaints. What the customers couldn't see was the way her eyes tracked exit routes, cataloged potential weapons, assessed threat levels with the automatic precision of someone trained to survive. The military bearing remained, even 3 years after her discharge. Even after the incident in Kandahar that had ended her career in Army intelligence before it truly began. Some training never left. Some wounds never fully healed. But the physical scars were hidden beneath her sleeve, and she had become expert at burying everything else beneath competent professionalism. Aria approached the private dining room carrying a tray of banchan, the small dishes that would accompany the main courses. Through the frosted glass, she could see the silhouettes of 4 men engaged in intense conversation. Their body language spoke of power carefully negotiated, of agreements that would never see the light of official documentation. She had served enough men like this to recognize the particular stillness that surrounded serious money and serious consequences. The partition slid open at her approach. Aria entered the private space and immediately felt the weight of absolute attention. The man at the head of the table looked at her with dark eyes that seemed to catalog every detail of her appearance, her posture, the precise way she carried herself. Not with the hungry assessment of men who saw service workers as conquests, but with the calculating interest of someone who recognized something unexpected. Jean watched her move around the table, placing dishes with economical precision. Her hands were steady, no nervous energy, no attempt to make herself smaller in the presence of obvious power. There was something about the way she carried herself that suggested training, discipline, a core of steel beneath the deferential service role. When she leaned forward to place the kimchi at his elbow, he caught the faint scent of vanilla and something cleaner, more complex. Not the cloying perfume most women wore to mask their intentions. "Thank you," he said, his voice carrying the slight formality of English as a carefully mastered second language. The words held more weight than simple politeness. Arya met his gaze for precisely the appropriate length of time. Professional acknowledgement without overstepping boundaries. But in that brief moment, something passed between them. Recognition, perhaps. The sense of depths carefully hidden beneath necessary surfaces. "Of course, sir," she replied, her voice warm but controlled. "Is there anything else I can bring for your party?" The question hung in the air as Jean considered her face. Strong cheekbones, full lips, skin that seemed to glow under the restaurant's amber lighting. Beautiful, certainly, but it was the intelligence in her dark brown eyes that held his attention. The way she stood suggested someone accustomed to command despite her current role. Someone with secrets worth discovering. Before he could respond, the restaurant's front entrance exploded inward with the sound of splintering wood and shattering glass. 5 men in black tactical gear burst through the main dining room, moving with military precision toward the private section. Customers screamed and dove under tables as automatic weapons swept across the space, muzzles trained on anyone who moved too quickly. Jin's hand was already moving toward the Glock 19 holstered beneath his jacket when the first man reached their partition. The frosted glass shattered as a boot connected with its center, sending crystalline fragments across the expensive carpet like deadly snow. Jin's dinner companions scattered, diving for whatever cover the minimal furniture could provide. The lead attacker was a mountain of muscle with Slavic features and eyes like winter. Russian Bratva, Jin realized. Dmitry Volkov's crew, here to settle a territorial dispute that had been simmering for months. The kind of conversation best conducted with bullets rather than words. "Get down," Jin commanded, his voice cutting through the chaos with absolute authority. But his eyes were on Arya, who had not moved from her position beside the table. Instead of cowering or fleeing, she had gone very still, her body settling into a stance that looked casual but was anything but. The second attacker raised his weapon toward Jean, finger tightening on the trigger. Time seemed to slow as Jean calculated angles, distances, the probability of reaching his gun before the bullet found its mark. His muscles coiled for movement that might be too late. Then Arya exploded into motion with a speed that defied comprehension. Her left hand swept the ceramic banchan dish from the table, hurling it with devastating accuracy at the gunman's wrist. Bone cracked. The weapon spun away, discharging harmlessly into the ceiling as his grip failed. Her right hand had already found the steak knife from Jin's place setting. One fluid movement brought the blade across the attacker's throat in a precise line that dropped him instantly, blood painting the pristine white tablecloth in arterial patterns. The third man swung his rifle toward this unexpected threat, but Arya was already moving. She rolled across the table, using the surface as both shield and launching point. Her feet connected with his solar plexus, driving him backward into the shattered partition. Glass fragments bit deep as he fell, his weapon skittering across marble flooring. Jean had his Glock out now, putting 2 controlled shots center mass into the fourth attacker before the man could acquire target. Professional. Clean. The kind of shooting that spoke of extensive training and absolute comfort with necessary violence. The fifth man had Arya in his sights when Jin's third shot took him in the head, painting abstract expressionism across the restaurant's exposed brick wall. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the distant sound of sirens and the quiet whimpers of traumatized customers in the main dining room. Arya stood among the bodies, not breathing hard despite the explosive violence of the previous 30 seconds. Her uniform was splattered with blood that was not her own. The steak knife remained in her grip, held with the casual competence of someone who had used edged weapons as tools of survival rather than mere implements. Jean stared at her across the wreckage of what had been an elegant dinner, his weapon still trained on the last threat until his tactical mind confirmed all hostiles were neutralized. Then his dark eyes returned to the woman who had just saved his life with skills that belonged in a war zone rather than a 5-star restaurant. "Who are you?" he asked quietly, his voice carrying dangerous undertones. Arya Thompson looked back at him with steady brown eyes that held no apology for the violence she had just unleashed. "Just someone trying to make rent," she replied, setting the bloodied knife on the table with the same careful precision she had used to serve his dinner. But they both knew that answer was only the beginning of a far more complicated truth. The dossier arrived on Jin's desk at 3 in the morning, 48 hours after the Hanul incident. His contact at the Defense Department owed him favors that went back to his father's generation, the kind of debts paid in information rather than currency. What he discovered about Arya Thompson made him reconsider everything he thought he knew about chance encounters. Staff Sergeant Arya Thompson, Army Intelligence, fluent in Arabic, Farsi, and Mandarin. Specialized training in close-quarters combat, psychological operations, and high-value target extraction. Honorably discharged following an incident in Kandahar province that remained classified at levels Jin's considerable reach could not penetrate. The official record was sanitized, professional, and utterly inadequate to explain how a decorated intelligence officer had ended up serving banchan in a Chicago restaurant. Jean studied the photograph clipped to her service record. Same intelligent eyes, same determined jawline. But the woman in military dress blues carried herself with an authority that her civilian waitress persona had carefully concealed. The transformation was remarkable in its completeness. Most people running from their past left traces, tells, unconscious habits that betrayed their true nature. Arya Thompson had buried her identity so thoroughly that even Jin's experienced I had missed the deception. Until 30 seconds of explosive violence had stripped away 3 years of careful construction. The second file that arrived with dawn contained information that made Jin's blood run cold. Dmitry Volkov's surveillance network had identified Arya as Jin's protector within 6 hours of the restaurant attack. Security footage, witness testimonies, the methodical investigation that followed any public bloodshed had painted a target on her back with bureaucratic efficiency. The Russians were thorough when it came to leverage. If they could not eliminate Jin directly, they would remove everything he valued until he became vulnerable enough to destroy. Family members, business associates, now, apparently, waitresses who had demonstrated inconvenient loyalty and devastating skills. Arya's one-bedroom apartment on the south side reflected the careful anonymity she had cultivated. Generic furniture that could have come from any discount retailer. No photographs, no personal items that might reveal history or connections. The kind of sterile environment maintained by someone who had learned to travel light and leave no traces. She was brewing coffee when the soft knock came at her door. Not the aggressive pounding of bill collectors or the tentative tapping of neighbors seeking borrowed sugar. This was the controlled rhythm of someone who expected to be admitted without question, someone accustomed to having doors open at their command. Arya moved to the window first, a habit that would never leave her. The black Mercedes sedan parked across the street was expensive enough to belong to legitimate business, discreet enough to avoid attention, armored enough to survive serious confrontation. Jin Quan stepped from the passenger side, his movements fluid despite the early morning hour. He wore a navy suit that probably cost more than she made in 6 months, but it was the way he carried himself that marked him as dangerous. The absolute confidence of someone who had never learned to doubt his right to occupy any space he chose. She opened the door before he could knock again. "Good morning, Mr. Quan. I assume this isn't a restaurant satisfaction survey." Jean studied her face, cataloging the absence of surprise at his appearance. The way she positioned herself to maintain control of the doorway while keeping one hand free for defensive movement. Even in civilian clothes, faded jeans, and a Northwestern University sweatshirt, she moved like someone prepared for violence. "We need to talk," he said simply. "May I come in?" The request was purely formal. They both knew he could enter whether she consented or not. But the fact that he asked revealed something about his character that Arya filed away for future reference. Jin Quan might be dangerous, but he observed certain courtesies even when exercising absolute power. She stepped aside, gesturing toward the small living room. Jean entered her space with the careful attention of someone evaluating tactical advantages. Exit routes, potential weapons, sight lines to windows and doors. Professional assessment that mirrored her own habitual awareness. "Your coffee smells excellent," he observed, settling into the armchair that provided the best view of both the front door and fire escape. The compliment carried no social warmth. Everything about Jean suggested a man who dealt in transactions rather than pleasantries. "Thank you. Would you care for some? Please." Arya moved to the kitchen, aware of his eyes tracking her movements. She could feel the weight of his attention like a physical presence, assessing and calculating. When she returned with 2 mugs, Jean had removed a tablet from his jacket pocket. The screen displayed what looked like surveillance photographs taken with telephoto lenses. "These were taken yesterday evening," he said, turning the device so she could see the images clearly. "3 men in a car parked outside the restaurant where you work. The same men who followed you home last night and photographed your building this morning." Arya's expression didn't change as she studied the faces. Slavic features, the kind of expensive casual clothing that marked them as professionals rather than street muscle. She recognized the tactical formation they maintained even while conducting surveillance, the way they positioned themselves to provide overlapping fields of fire. Russian, she observed, probably Bratva, given the quality of their equipment and their willingness to operate in your territory. They're not particularly subtle about their interest. Jean nodded approvingly. Most civilians would have focused on the threat to their personal safety. Arya immediately analyzed the operational parameters and tactical implications. Former military intelligence, indeed. Dmitry Volkov's crew, Jean confirmed. They've identified you as someone worth leveraging. Your intervention at Hanul marked you as either an asset they could use or a threat they need to eliminate. Given your demonstrated capabilities, they appear to have chosen elimination. Arya sipped her coffee, using the moment to process implications and calculate options. The bitter taste grounded her as she considered the scope of the problem. 3 years of careful anonymity destroyed by 30 seconds of instinctive action. The past she had buried so completely was clawing its way back to the surface. "What do you propose?" she asked finally. "You move into my compound until the situation is resolved," Jean replied without hesitation. "Complete security, full protection, everything you need provided. And in exchange, you continue being exactly what you revealed yourself to be. Someone with the skills and judgment to keep dangerous people alive." Arya set down her mug and leaned back at her chair, studying Jin's face. The offer was couched as a business arrangement, but she could see the calculation behind his dark eyes. He wanted her skills under his control, her loyalty secured through obligation and proximity. "I'm not interested in returning to that life," she said quietly. "I left the army for good reasons." "The army left you," Jean corrected, his voice gentle but implacable. "Your choice now is between accepting my protection and dealing with Volkov's people on your own. They won't make the mistake of underestimating you twice." As if summoned by his words, the sound of breaking glass came from the bedroom window. Arya was moving before the first shard hit the floor, rolling behind the couch as automatic weapons fire-chewed through the thin apartment walls. Jean had his pistol out and was returning fire through the front windows, his shots controlled and deliberate. "Move," he commanded, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Back exit now." Arya didn't argue. She grabbed the go bag that had been packed and ready for 3 years, muscle memory guiding her through the tactical withdrawal she had rehearsed but never expected to use. Jean covered their movement with precision fire that spoke of extensive training and absolute comfort with lethal force. They reached his Mercedes as the apartment building erupted in flames behind them. Jin's driver had the engine running and the armor plating angled to deflect incoming rounds. As they sped away from the destruction of her carefully constructed civilian life, Arya stared at the inferno consuming everything she had built since leaving the military. "I suppose you have your answer," Jean observed, his voice carrying no satisfaction at being proven correct. "Welcome to my world, Aria Thompson. She turned to study his profile as Chicago blurred past the bulletproof windows. The compound he described waited somewhere ahead, a fortress where protection and captivity would prove to be the same thing. But as she watched Jean check his weapon with the casual competence of someone for whom violence was simply another business tool, Aria realized she was no longer sure which of them was the predator and which was the prey. The Mercedes carried them toward a future neither of them fully understood, while behind them, the smoke from her former life darkened the morning sky like a funeral pyre for the ordinary woman she had tried so hard to become. The compound sprawled across 15 acres of lake forest property, hidden behind stone walls that looked decorative but were reinforced with steel and surveillance technology. From the outside, it resembled the estate of a successful technology executive or hedge fund manager. Inside, Aria quickly recognized the sophisticated security apparatus that marked it as something far more complex. Her guest suite occupied the compound's east wing, separated from Jin's private quarters by a central courtyard that bloomed with carefully maintained Korean peonies. The rooms were elegant in their simplicity. Clean lines, natural materials, furniture that managed to be both beautiful and functional. A prison cell designed by someone with impeccable taste and unlimited resources. 3 days of careful observation revealed the compound's vulnerabilities with crystalline clarity. The guards rotated on predictable schedules. The camera coverage had blind spots near the service entrance. The perimeter sensors could be defeated with proper timing and basic electronic countermeasures. Jin's security was impressive by civilian standards, but it had been designed by people who thought like criminals rather than soldiers. Aria spent the morning drafting a comprehensive analysis, her fingers moving across her laptop keyboard with the precise rhythm of someone translating tactical thinking into actionable recommendations. When she finished, the document contained 47 specific suggestions for improving the compound's defensive capabilities, from repositioning camera angles to upgrading motion detection algorithms. She found Jean in his study, a room that managed to feel both imposing and intimate. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined the walls, filled with volumes in Korean, English, and what appeared to be classical Chinese. His desk was a masterpiece of minimalist design, its surface bearing only a laptop, a single fountain pen, and a framed photograph of an elderly man whose features shared Jin's aristocratic bone structure. Jean looked up from the financial reports he had been reviewing, his dark eyes immediately focusing with the intensity she was beginning to recognize as his default state of attention. He wore a white dress shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows, revealing forearms corded with muscle and marked by a thin scar that ran from wrist to elbow. "Good morning," he said formally. "I trust you slept well." Aria placed the printed analysis on his desk, the pages aligned with military precision, as well as could be expected in a fortress with 17 major security flaws. Jin's eyebrows rose slightly, the first crack in his composed expression since she had known him. He picked up the document, his eyes scanning the detailed recommendations with growing interest. As he read, Aria watched his face transform from polite skepticism to genuine respect. "This is remarkably thorough," he said finally. "You identified vulnerabilities that our security consultants missed completely." "Your consultants think like criminals," Aria replied, settling into the chair across from his desk without invitation. "They understand how to keep out competitors and law enforcement. They don't understand how to repel coordinated military assault. And you do. It was my job for 7 years." Jean set the analysis aside and leaned back in his chair, studying her face with new appreciation. "What happened in Kandahar?" he asked quietly. Aria's expression didn't change, but he caught the slight tightening around her eyes that suggested old pain carefully controlled. "That's classified above your clearance level," she replied evenly. Before Jean could respond, his phone buzzed with an incoming message. As he glanced at the screen, his jaw tightened imperceptibly. Family obligation that could not be delayed or delegated, the kind of burden that came with leadership whether one wanted it or not. "I have business to attend to," he said, standing from his desk with fluid grace. "Make yourself comfortable. Mrs. Kim will prepare lunch if you're hungry." As he moved toward the door, Jean paused, turning back to face her with an expression that seemed almost vulnerable. "The analysis," he said quietly. "Thank you. It shows remarkable insight." After he left, Arya remained in the study, surrounded by the accumulated knowledge of generations. She pulled a volume of Korean poetry from the shelf, surprised to find English translations facing the original text. The verses spoke of honor, sacrifice, the weight of protecting those who could not protect themselves, themes that seemed to resonate with the man who had built this beautiful prison. That evening found her in the compound's kitchen, a space that managed to be both professionally equipped and warmly inviting. Mrs. Kim, the elderly housekeeper, had graciously allowed her to prepare dinner, though the woman's protective concern for Jean was evident in every worried glance. Arya moved through the preparation of jambalaya with the same focused precision she brought to everything else. The rice, the holy trinity of vegetables, the careful balance of spices that would transform simple ingredients into something that tasted like home. Cooking was meditation, muscle memory that connected her to the grandmother who had raised her after her parents' deaths. Jean appeared in the doorway as she was adding the final seasoning, drawn by aromas that were completely foreign to his carefully controlled world. He watched her move through the kitchen with obvious competence, noting the way she handled knives with professional skill and tasted her work with the confidence of someone who understood flavor at a molecular level. "You cook," he observed. "Everyone should know how to feed themselves," Arya replied, not looking up from stirring the pan. "It's a basic survival skill. Most people in your situation would be demanding to return home. Most people in my situation haven't spent 7 years learning that home is something you carry with you rather than a place you can return to." Jean moved closer, close enough to catch the scent of her shampoo mingling with the rich spices filling the kitchen, close enough to see the small scar that curved along her left temple, almost hidden by her hairline, close enough to notice the way her breathing changed when she became aware of his proximity. "What is it?" he asked, indicating the simmering pot. "Jambalaya, comfort food from New Orleans by way of my grandmother's kitchen in Detroit. She used to say that any problem looked smaller after a good meal shared with people who mattered." The casual mention of people who mattered hung in the air between them, weighted with implications neither was quite ready to acknowledge. Jean found himself wondering when he had last shared a meal prepared with care rather than obligation, when food had been about connection rather than mere sustenance. As they sat down to eat, Arya watched Jean taste the jambalaya with careful attention, noting the way his expression shifted from polite interest to genuine appreciation. The spices were bolder than anything in his usual diet, the flavors complex in ways that spoke of cultural fusion and culinary creativity. "This is excellent," he said, and she could hear the surprise in his voice. "Where did you learn to cook like this?" "My grandmother," Arya replied. She believed that knowing your way around a kitchen was as important as knowing your way around a battlefield. Both skills keep you alive, just in different ways. As if summoned by mention of battlefields, the nightmares came that evening with particular viciousness. Arya woke in her elegant guest suite with her heart hammering and her body slick with sweat, the taste of Afghan dust coating her tongue and the sound of explosions echoing in her ears. The memories came in fragments, sand and blood and the weight of decisions that had destroyed everything she thought she knew about honor and duty. She was sitting on the terrace outside her room, wrapped in a silk robe, and trying to convince her nervous system that she was safe, when Jean appeared like a shadow, given substance. He wore dark pants and nothing else, his chest bare in the humid night air. The dragon tattoo that curved across his shoulder was fully visible now, intricate work that spoke of hours under the needle and deep cultural significance. "Bad dreams," he said quietly, settling into the chair beside her without asking permission. "Occupational hazard," Arya replied, grateful that he didn't offer meaningless reassurance or empty sympathy. "Sometimes the past refuses to stay buried." Jean was quiet for a long moment, his eyes focused on the carefully maintained gardens that surrounded them with beauty and the illusion of peace. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight that suggested his own experience with sleepless nights and unwelcome memories. My father used to say that the price of leadership was carrying the weight of every decision, every consequence, every life affected by your choices. Some burdens never get lighter. You just develop stronger shoulders. He reached over and gently took her hand, his fingers tracing the thin white line that ran across her knuckles. Old injury, poorly healed, the kind of scar that spoke of violence survived rather than medical attention received. His touch was careful, reverent, as if he understood that her scars were sacred things not to be treated lightly. The gesture was so unexpected, so tender from a man who projected nothing but controlled strength, that Arya felt something crack open inside her chest. Some wall she had built around the part of herself that still believed in human connection despite everything war had taught her about the fragility of trust. "You don't have to carry everything alone," Jean said quietly. "Not while you're here." The promise hung between them in the warm night air, weighted with possibilities that neither was quite ready to name. But as they sat in comfortable silence, hands linked in acknowledgement of shared wounds and mutual recognition, Arya began to understand that Jean Quan was far more complex than the dangerous reputation that preceded him. He was a man who built fortresses to protect others while imprisoning himself. Someone who understood duty and sacrifice at levels that civilian life could never teach. Someone whose carefully controlled exterior hid depths that might be worth the considerable risk of exploration. When she finally returned to her room, Arya carried the memory of his touch like a talisman against the darkness that lived in her dreams. For the first time in 3 years, she slept without nightmares, protected by the presence of someone who understood that some battles never truly ended, they just changed theaters of operation. The confession came on a rain-soaked Thursday morning, 3 weeks after Arya had begun living in Jin's carefully controlled world. She had been training in the compound's private gymnasium, working through combat drills with an intensity that spoke of demons being exorcised through physical exhaustion. Jean found her there, her body moving through knife techniques with lethal precision, each movement flowing into the next like a deadly dance choreographed by years of military conditioning. He watched her train with growing understanding, recognizing the particular fury that drove someone to push their body past rational limits. This was an exercise. This was penance, self-punishment dressed as physical conditioning. When she finally stopped, her chest heaving and her uniform soaked with sweat, Jean approached with the careful caution of someone approaching a wounded predator. "You fight like someone trying to kill ghosts," he observed quietly. Arya wiped her face with a towel, using the moment to decide how much truth she was willing to reveal. In the weeks of proximity, Jean had proven himself capable of understanding complexities that most people preferred to ignore. His own carefully controlled exterior suggested familiarity with the weight of decisions that left permanent marks on the soul. "Kandahar province," she said finally. "Joint operation with British SAS. High-value target extraction in a compound that intelligence assured us was lightly defended." The intelligence was wrong. Jean settled onto the bench beside her, close enough to provide comfort without crowding her space. His presence was steady, patient, the kind of quiet strength that invited confidences without demanding them. "We went in fast and light," Arya continued, her voice carrying the flat tone of someone recounting tactical failures rather than personal trauma. 12 operators. The target was supposed to be isolated, minimal security. Instead, we walked into a fully prepared defensive position with 30 hostiles and a civilian population being used as human shields. The rain drummed against the gymnasium's windows, providing rhythmic punctuation to words that had been held in silence for 3 years. Jean remained motionless, understanding that some stories needed to emerge at their own pace. "I was the intelligence analyst," Arya said. "My job was to provide real-time assessment, coordinate with drone support, make the calls that would get everyone home alive. When the situation deteriorated, when it became clear that our extraction was compromised, I had to choose between the mission objective and civilian casualties. She stood and moved to the window, her reflection ghost-like in the rain-streaked glass. The woman in the reflection looked haunted, marked by decisions that had changed the fundamental architecture of her soul. There were children in the compound, she whispered, families who had no choice about being there. The target was using them as insurance, knowing that American rules of engagement would protect him as long as innocents were in the line of fire. "What did you do?" Jean asked, though his tone suggested he already understood the terrible mathematics of the choice she had faced. "I called in the airstrike anyway. Surgical precision, minimal civilian impact, but not zero. Never zero. The target was eliminated. The mission was technically successful, and I saved the lives of 8 operators who would have died in a prolonged engagement. But 3 families died because of my decision. 12 people who were guilty of nothing except being in the wrong place when powerful men decided their fate." Jean stood and moved behind her, his presence a solid warmth at her back. His reflection joined hers in the window. 2 people marked by the weight of necessary choices and their unforgivable consequences. "How many lives did you save?" he asked quietly. "The mathematics don't matter," Arya replied. "A utilitarian calculus that reduces human lives to strategic assets. The families I killed deserve better than being acceptable losses in someone else's war." Jin's hands settled on her shoulders with infinite gentleness, his touch grounding her in the present moment rather than the endless replay of ancient failures. "You made an impossible choice with incomplete information under extreme pressure," he said. "The fact that it haunts you proves your humanity, not your guilt." That evening, as they shared dinner in the compound's formal dining room, Jean found himself offering his own confession with a vulnerability that surprised them both. The weight of leadership had been thrust upon him at 25 when his father's heart attack had transformed him overnight from favored son to absolute patriarch of an organization that touched thousands of lives. "People think power means freedom," he said, his fingers absently turning the platinum ring that marked his authority. "In reality, it means that every decision you make ripples outward in ways you cannot predict or control. Every choice affects not just yourself, but everyone who depends on your judgment for their survival." Arya watched his face as he spoke, noting the way his carefully controlled expression revealed glimpses of isolation that came with absolute responsibility. Jean carried the weight of his organization like a physical burden, the knowledge that hundreds of families depended on his decisions for their security and prosperity. "When I was younger, I thought leadership meant having the power to shape the world according to your vision," Jean continued. "Now I understand that it means accepting responsibility for consequences you never intended and sacrifices you never wanted to make." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Jin's younger sister, Minyoung, whose presence transformed the formal dining room into something warmer and more human. At 26, she possessed the kind of elegant beauty that came from generations of aristocratic breeding, but her smile carried genuine warmth that made formal introductions unnecessary. "Appa has been very secretive about his house guest," Minyoung said, settling into the chair across from Arya with the casual confidence of someone who had never learned to doubt her welcome anywhere. "I had to come see for myself what kind of woman could capture my brother's attention so completely." Jin's jaw tightened slightly at his sister's directness, but Arya caught the protective affection in his eyes as he watched Minyoung charm her way through the evening. This was a man who would burn the world to keep his sister safe, who carried the burden of leadership partly to ensure that she could live freely in a way that his position would never allow him. As the evening progressed, Arya found herself drawn into stories of Jin's childhood, tales that revealed a boy who had been groomed for power, but had retained an unexpected capacity for gentleness. Minyoung painted pictures of a brother who had taught her to swim in Lake Michigan, who had attended every school performance despite his crushing responsibilities, who had quietly ensured that her path through life remained unobstructed by the shadows that surrounded his world. The following weekend brought Chuseok, the Korean harvest festival that Minyoung insisted they celebrate properly despite Jin's initial resistance. The compound was transformed with traditional decorations, paper lanterns casting warm light across gardens that bloomed with autumn flowers. The formal dining room became a feast space where generations of tradition met the present moment in a celebration of gratitude and family connection. Jean had given Arya permission to leave the compound for the celebration, a gesture of trust that spoke volumes about how their relationship had evolved. "You are not my prisoner," he had said simply. "You are my guest, and guests should have the freedom to choose their level of participation in family obligations." The offer had surprised her with its generosity, but as Arya watched Jean and Minyoung prepare traditional foods with obvious affection for shared rituals, she realized that leaving had never been a serious consideration. Somewhere in the past weeks, the compound had begun to feel less like captivity and more like belonging. As the evening deepened, Minyoung retired to her guest room, leaving Jean and Arya alone on the terrace that overlooked the gardens. Paper lanterns swayed in the autumn breeze, casting shifting patterns of light and shadow across their faces. The air smelled of chrysanthemums and the distant promise of winter. "Your sister adores you," Arya observed, noting the way Jin's entire demeanor had softened throughout the evening. "She is the only purely good thing in my life," Jean replied quietly. "Everything I do, every choice I make, is measured against my responsibility to keep her safe and free from the consequences of what I am." "And what are you?" Arya asked, though she thought she already knew the answer. Jean turned to face her fully, his dark eyes reflecting the lantern light like deep water. "Someone who destroys beautiful things by touching them," he said simply. "Someone whose love becomes another kind of cage for anyone foolish enough to want it." The words hung between them like a confession and a warning, weighted with longing and resignation in equal measure. Arya understood that he was offering her an escape route, a chance to step back from whatever was building between them before it became too complicated to untangle. Instead, she moved closer, close enough to see the way his breathing changed, close enough to catch the scent of sandalwood and something indefinably masculine that made her pulse quicken. Close enough to understand that some cages were chosen rather than imposed. "Maybe I'm tired of being safe," she whispered, her voice carrying 3 years of careful distance and professional detachment being burned away by proximity to someone who understood the weight of impossible choices. Jin's control cracked like ice under sudden pressure. His hands framed her face with desperate reverence, thumbs tracing the line of her cheekbones as if he could memorize her features through touch alone. When he kissed her, it was with the hunger of someone who had been starving without realizing it, the desperate need of a man who had forgotten what it felt like to want something for himself rather than for duty or obligation. Arya kissed him back with equal hunger, her hands fisting in the expensive fabric of his shirt, as 3 years of emotional numbness gave way to sensation that threatened to overwhelm her carefully maintained defenses. This was not the gentle exploration of new romance, but the collision of two people who had found something in each other that they had not even known they were missing. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Jean rested his forehead against hers in a gesture of intimacy more profound than the kiss itself. "I cannot promise you safety," he whispered. "Everything in my world comes with consequences. I stopped believing in safety a long time ago," Arya replied, her voice steady despite the way her heart was hammering against her ribs. "But I still believe in worth, in fighting for something that matters." As they stood together under the swaying lanterns, both understanding that they had crossed a line from which there would be no retreat, neither spoke the words that had become impossible to deny. Love was too dangerous to acknowledge, too powerful to resist, too necessary to survive without. But in the silence between heartbeats, in the space between breathing and surrender, they both accepted the truth that would reshape everything they thought they knew about the price of connection and the courage required to claim happiness in a world that specialized in taking beautiful things away. The engagement party for Minyoung and her fiancé, David, transformed the compound into something magical. Paper lanterns and white roses creating an atmosphere of celebration that temporarily masked the fortress's true nature. 200 guests moved through the gardens with champagne and laughter, the kind of elegant gathering that graced the society pages of Chicago magazines. Politicians, business leaders, cultural luminaries who had no idea they were celebrating in the heart of one of the city's most sophisticated criminal enterprises. Arya moved through the crowd with practiced invisibility, her black cocktail dress allowing her to blend among the service staff while maintaining tactical overwatch of the celebration. Jean had insisted she attend as a guest, but old habits demanded she position herself where she could observe potential threats while appearing to simply enjoy the evening's festivities. She watched Jean work the crowd with effortless charm, his tailored tuxedo and genuine smile transforming him into the perfect host rather than the dangerous predator she had come to know. With his sister glowing beside him and her fiancé beaming with obvious devotion, Jean looked like nothing more threatening than a successful businessman celebrating family happiness. The illusion shattered at 9:37 when the first explosion rocked the compound's eastern wall. Arya's military training kicked in before the sound finished echoing across the gardens. She was already moving as panicked guests began screaming, her eyes automatically cataloging exit routes and defensive positions while her hands checked for the weapons Jean had insisted she carry despite the formal setting. The lights went out in coordinated precision, plunging the celebration into darkness broken only by emergency lighting and the orange glow of flames where the shaped charges had breached the perimeter. Through her earpiece, she could hear Jin's security team reporting contact with multiple hostiles advancing through the gardens with military discipline and overwhelming firepower. Dmitry Volkov had come to finish what he started at the restaurant, but this time he had brought an army. Arya reached Min Jung's position as the first gunfire erupted from the Rose Garden. The young woman was frozen with terror, her elegant gown making her a target visible even in the dim emergency lighting. David was trying to shield her with his body, but his civilian instincts were no match for the coordinated assault advancing toward the main house. "Get her to the safe room," Arya commanded, her voice cutting through the chaos with absolute authority. "Now." But David hesitated, his protective instincts warring with the impossibility of the situation. Arya didn't have time for civilian indecision. She grabbed Min Jung's hand and began moving toward the house, trusting that survival instinct would overcome shock paralysis. They had covered half the distance when a second wave of attackers emerged from the compound's western gardens. Professional operators in tactical gear, moving with the kind of coordinated precision that spoke of extensive training and detailed intelligence about the compound's layout. Someone had provided them with architectural plans and security protocols. Someone inside Jin's organization had betrayed them. Arya pushed Min Jung behind the marble fountain that dominated the main courtyard, the heavy stone providing temporary cover from the automatic weapons fire that began chewing through the carefully maintained landscape. She could see Jean across the courtyard, his tuxedo jacket discarded, and his pistol tracking targets with deadly efficiency. Even in formal wear, he moved like the predator he had always been, every shot controlled and lethal. "Stay down," Arya told Min Jung firmly. "No matter what happens, do not move from this position until I come back for you." Then she was moving again, her own weapon appearing in her hands as muscle memory took control. The first attacker never saw her coming. She put 2 rounds center mass before he could acquire a target, his rifle clattering across marble tiles as he fell. The second man managed to swing his weapon toward her, but Arya was already rolling, using the fountain's base as cover while her shots found their mark with surgical precision. Jean appeared beside her, his face grim with the kind of controlled fury that transformed him into something genuinely terrifying. "They've breached the main house," he said tersely. "At least 12 hostiles inside, moving toward the family wing." Arya nodded, understanding the tactical situation without needing detailed explanation. The attackers had divided their forces to overwhelm the compound's defenses while a strike team moved to eliminate Jin's family members. Classic high-value target elimination, designed to destroy his power base through personal destruction. "Cover me," she said simply, and Jean fell into formation beside her, as if they had been operating as a team for years rather than weeks. They moved through the compound like a force of nature, Aria's military training complementing Jin's intimate knowledge of every corridor and defensive position. Where she sought tactical advantages, he understood architectural vulnerabilities. Where he recognized potential ambush points, she provided technical solutions that turned defensive positions into death traps for their attackers. The strike team had reached the family wing when Aria and Jean caught up to them. 6 men in full tactical gear, moving through the hallway with professional discipline toward the safe room where Jin's elderly mother and other family members had taken shelter. The kind of operators who specialized in eliminating protected targets through overwhelming violence and tactical superiority. They never expected to face someone with Aria's particular combination of skills and absolute motivation. She went through them like a scythe through wheat, her movements flowing from target to target with lethal efficiency. Jean provided precision fire that eliminated threats she couldn't reach, while maintaining tactical spacing that allowed both of them to maneuver without interfering with each other's fields of fire. Together, they cleared the hallway in less than 30 seconds, leaving behind the kind of devastation that spoke of professional competence applied with personal fury. As they reached the safe room door, Aria's tactical awareness screamed, warning a split second before the sniper's bullet shattered the marble column beside her head. She threw herself sideways, driving Jean to the ground as the second shot carved a line of fire across her left shoulder. Blood bloomed across the black fabric of her dress, but she was already moving, her mind calculating angles and probable positions for the shooter. The third shot came from the compound's bell tower, a position that provided commanding views of the entire courtyard and family wing. Professional hide, professional shooter, probably equipped with night vision and precision optics. The kind of overwatch position that could deny them access to the safe room indefinitely, while other teams moved to eliminate Jin's trapped family members. Aria looked at Jean, saw her own understanding reflected in his dark eyes. Someone had to neutralize the sniper, and someone had to secure the family. They both knew which of them was better suited for each mission. "Get to your family," she said quietly. "I'll handle the tower." Jin's jaw tightened with protest, but military logic overruled emotional objection. Aria was the better close-quarters combatant, and he was the only one who could operate the safe room's biometric security. Division of labor based on tactical necessity rather than personal preference. "Be careful," he said simply, the words carrying 3 lifetimes' worth of unspoken emotion. Aria kissed him quickly, tasting desperation and promise in equal measure. "Come back to me," she whispered against his lips. Then she was gone, moving through the compound's service corridors toward the bell tower, while Jean turned toward the safe room and the family members who depended on his protection for their survival. The tower stairs were narrow and defensible, the kind of approach that favored a prepared sniper over an advancing attacker. Aria climbed in silence, using techniques learned in Afghan mountains where every footstep could trigger an avalanche of automatic weapons fire. The sniper was good, professional, but he had made the classic mistake of assuming his position was impregnable. He never considered that someone might approach from the tower's maintenance access, climbing the exterior stonework with the kind of tactical mountaineering skills that the Army had drilled into her during specialized training in Colorado. When Aria emerged through the tower service window, she was behind the sniper's position with a clear line of attack. The knife went between his 3rd and 4th ribs, angled upward to find the heart with the precision of someone who understood human anatomy at a technical level. He died quietly, professionally, without the drama that movies suggested accompanied such encounters. Aria was turning to signal Jean that the overwatch position was secure when the compound's main house erupted in flames behind her. Secondary explosions, probably incendiary charges designed to destroy evidence and eliminate any witnesses who might have survived the initial assault. The kind of comprehensive destruction that spoke of a plan designed to leave no traces and no survivors. Through the tower's windows, she could see Jean silhouetted against the flames as he led his family members to safety through the compound's emergency exit system. Even at this distance, she could read the controlled fury in his movements, the way absolute protective instinct had transformed him into something that transcended ordinary human limitations. When the shooting finally stopped, when the last of Volkov's assault team had been eliminated or driven off, Arya found herself sitting on the tower stairs with her head spinning from blood loss and adrenaline crash. The shoulder wound was worse than she had initially realized, the bullet having torn through muscle and scraped bone in ways that would require serious medical attention. Jean found her there 20 minutes later, his tuxedo torn and bloodied, but his family safe behind him. When he saw the extent of her injury, his carefully maintained control cracked like ice under pressure. "Hospital," he said tersely, lifting her with the kind of desperate gentleness that spoke of someone handling something infinitely precious and irreplaceably fragile. Now, as the medical team worked to stabilize her condition, as Jean paced the emergency room with the controlled fury of a caged predator, Arya drifted in and out of consciousness on waves of medication and exhaustion. But even through the haze of trauma and treatment, she could hear Jin's voice beside her bed, low and urgent, and weighted with emotions he had never learned to express safely. "You cannot leave me," he whispered when he thought she was unconscious. "Not now. Not when I have finally found something worth protecting beyond duty and obligation." When Arya's eyes opened hours later, Jean was beside her bed in the private room that his money and influence had secured. His face was haggard with worry and sleepless vigil, his expensive clothes replaced by surgical scrubs that made him look younger and more vulnerable than she had ever seen him. "Hi," she said softly, her voice hoarse from medication and breathing tubes. "Hi," Jean replied, his relief so profound that it transformed his entire expression. "How do you feel?" "Like I got shot protecting someone I love," Arya admitted, the words emerging without conscious decision. "Someone whose family matters more to me than my own safety." Jin's hand found hers, his fingers interlacing with a desperate tenderness that spoke of prayers answered and futures suddenly possible. "I love you too," he said quietly. "More than honor, more than duty, more than everything I thought defined my life." As morning light filtered through the hospital windows, as the immediate crisis gave way to the complicated business of rebuilding and moving forward, Jean and Arya held each other with the desperate gratitude of people who had faced the possibility of permanent loss and emerged with something stronger than they had dared to imagine. The war with Volkov was over, ended by overwhelming force and strategic precision. But the battle for their future together was just beginning, and both understood that some victories were worth any price necessary to claim them. The cleanup took 3 weeks. Jean moved through the aftermath of Volkov's failed assault with the methodical precision of someone consolidating power while eliminating future threats. Bodies were disposed of through channels that left no forensic evidence. Damaged sections of the compound were rebuilt with upgraded security that incorporated every recommendation from Arya's original analysis. Most importantly, the network of corruption that had enabled the attack was systematically dismantled through a combination of strategic violence and financial pressure that left no room for future betrayals. Dmitry Volkov himself died quietly in a federal holding cell, officially from complications related to a heart condition that had never appeared in his medical records. The remaining leadership of his organization either fled Chicago permanently or accepted new employment arrangements that placed them firmly under Jin's authority. Within a month, the territorial dispute that had endangered both their lives had been resolved with the kind of comprehensive finality that only overwhelming force could achieve. Arya spent her recovery period studying the structural changes Jean implemented throughout his organization. Her injury had provided perspective on vulnerabilities that went beyond mere physical security. Trust networks, communication protocols, the delicate balance between loyalty and fear that kept large criminal enterprises functional. She drafted reports that Jean read with growing appreciation for her strategic thinking, her ability to see patterns that his traditional advisors missed completely. When the doctors cleared her for full activity, Arya expected their arrangement to return to its original parameters. Protection contract fulfilled, external threats eliminated, both parties free to resume their separate lives. Instead, she found Jean in his study one evening, surrounded by legal documents and wearing the expression of someone preparing to propose the most important business arrangement of his life. "Your contract with me has been completed," he said formally, setting aside the papers he had been reviewing. "Volkov's organization has been neutralized, the compound is secure, and you're no longer in danger from my enemies." Arya settled into the chair across from his desk, noting the careful distance he maintained despite everything they had shared. Professional courtesy masking emotional vulnerability, the kind of protective formality that men like Jean use to survive disappointment. "So I'm free to go," she observed. "You are always free to go," Jean replied quietly. "What I am offering now is the choice to stay, but on completely different terms." He slid a leather portfolio across the desk, his movements precise, despite the way his hands trembled almost imperceptibly. Inside, Arya found documents that took her breath away. Financial arrangements that would secure her independence for life. Property deeds, investment accounts, the kind of comprehensive wealth transfer that spoke of someone preparing to give away everything that mattered. "You don't owe me anything," she said carefully. Jean stood and moved to the window, his shoulders tense with the kind of controlled emotion that threatened to overwhelm his legendary self-discipline. "This has nothing to do with debt," he said quietly. "This is me asking you to build a life with me, because I cannot imagine a future without you in it." The proposal came 3 days later, orchestrated with the kind of cultural sensitivity that demonstrated how carefully Jean had considered every detail. He had arranged a traditional Korean tea ceremony in the compound's garden pavilion, complete with his mother's presence and formal presentations that honored both families despite the complex circumstances of their meeting. But when Jean knelt before her in the traditional manner, offering the ornate wooden box that contained a ring designed specifically for her, he spoke in English first, then Korean, ensuring that every word carried meaning in both cultures that had shaped their understanding of love and commitment. "Arya Thompson," he said, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was offering, "will you accept my protection, my devotion, and my promise to build something together that honors both our strength and our vulnerabilities?" The ring was a masterpiece of design that somehow managed to be both elegant and practical. A central diamond surrounded by smaller stones in a setting that would not catch on clothing or interfere with the kind of physical activity their shared life would inevitably require. Beauty engineered for someone who understood that luxury and functionality were not mutually exclusive concepts. But before she answered, Arya had terms of her own to negotiate. "I want partnership, not protection," she said clearly. "I want to be your security chief, not just your wife. I want to contribute to building something that matters, not just be a beautiful ornament in your beautiful cage." Jin's smile was radiant with relief and admiration. "Those terms are completely acceptable," he replied formally. "More than acceptable. They are exactly what I was hoping you would demand." The wedding took place 6 weeks later in a ceremony that blended Korean tradition with American practicality in ways that honored both their cultures. Minyoung served as matron of honor, beaming with the kind of happiness that comes from seeing beloved family members claim their right to joy despite impossible circumstances. Jin's mother, initially skeptical of her son's choice in brides, had been won over by Arya's respectful attention to cultural protocols and her obvious competence in protecting the family that mattered most. The ceremony itself was intimate, limited to family and the closest associates whose loyalty had been proven through fire and blood. But within that small gathering, the commitment they formalized carried the weight of absolute devotion, freely chosen and mutually earned. As they exchanged vows that promised partnership rather than possession, protection rather than dominance, Arya felt the final pieces of her fractured identity clicking into place. She was no longer a waitress hiding from her past or a soldier without a mission. She was someone building a future with a man whose strength complemented her own, whose understanding of duty and sacrifice created space for love to flourish despite the dangerous world they chose to inhabit together. 1 year later, Arya stood in the compound's renovated security center, her hand resting on the gentle curve of her pregnancy, while she reviewed the night's operational reports. The sophisticated monitoring systems she had designed provided comprehensive coverage of not just the compound, but the entire network of legitimate businesses that formed the foundation of Jin's expanding empire. Under her guidance, the organization had evolved from a traditional crime family into something more complex and sustainable, still dangerous when necessary, but increasingly focused on legitimate enterprises that provided security and prosperity for hundreds of families. The transition had not been without violence, but it had been managed with the kind of strategic thinking that minimized casualties while maximizing long-term stability. Jean appeared in the doorway of the security center, carrying 2 cups of the ginger tea that helped with her morning sickness. Even after a year of marriage, the sight of him in his perfectly tailored suits still made her pulse quicken with appreciation for the man she had claimed as completely as he had claimed her. "How are our operations looking today?" he asked, settling beside her at the console that had become her command center. "Quiet," Arya replied, leaning into his warmth while her eyes continued scanning the multiple displays that showed their various interests across the city. "No threats detected. All business proceeding according to plan, and your wife is successfully growing your heir without any complications." Jin's hand joined hers on her belly, his touch reverent with the kind of wonder that came from someone who had never expected to have something so precious to protect. "Our heir," he corrected gently. "Our future." As morning sunlight streamed through the security center's windows, as the compound around them hummed with the controlled activity of an empire built on mutual respect rather than fear, Arya reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. From collision to captivity to partnership to love, they had traveled a path that transformed both their understanding of what was possible when 2 people chose to build something together rather than simply survive separately. The dangerous world still existed beyond their walls. There would always be threats to manage, territories to defend, the delicate balance between legitimate business and necessary violence to maintain. But they would face those challenges together, as partners who had proven their devotion through fire and emerged stronger for having been tested. In the end, the cage had become a sanctuary, captivity had transformed into chosen commitment, and 2 people who had thought themselves too damaged for love had discovered that sometimes the most beautiful things grew from the most dangerous soil. As Jean kissed her temple and murmured plans for their expanding family in a mixture of Korean endearments and English practicality, Arya smiled with the satisfaction of someone who had finally found her way home to a place she had never known she was seeking.